Today, we're going to trace the incredible financial journey of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We'll see how it went from being on the brink of collapse to the corporate powerhouse it is now. And believe me, the story is probably not what you're expecting. Let's dive in. You know, when you think of the LDS Church today, you probably think of this massive, wealthy, global organization. But that's actually a pretty recent thing. For most of its history, the church was dealing with constant money problems, even near bankruptcy, and had policies that, well, they would look totally alien to members today. So get this. What if tithing meant giving all your extra property to the church when you converted? And what if local bishops actually got paid from the tithing they collected? Or how about if the church published a super detailed financial report every single year? Sounds wild, right? Well, this wasn't some what-if scenario. For a while, that was exactly how it worked. Okay, so to really get how the church went through this massive financial change, we've got to start with the absolute basics, tithing. You see, the biggest shift in the church's financial history wasn't some complicated investment scheme or a new business venture. Nope, it all came down to changing the very definition of what tithing was.
Just look at the difference here. Back in 1838, the law of tithing was, wow, it was a huge commitment. When you joined, you had to give up all of your surplus property right away. And then, on top of that, you had to pay 10% of your income every year. Fast forward to 1899, and it simplified to just 10% of your annual income. That's the system we're all familiar with today.
And this early system had a real human cost. I mean, listen to this story. There was an apostle, John E. Page, who actually felt guilty collecting tithing. He had to take the last $4 from an impoverished man who was just trying to do what was asked of him. You can just imagine how heavy, how absolutely crushing that burden must have been. So you have to ask, did this super demanding system even work? The short answer? Not really. Brigham Young himself figured that between 1847 and 1870, less than 10% of members were actually paying their tithing in full. The rule was just too hard. People couldn't do it, and that meant the whole system was, well, completely unsustainable. All right, so something had to change, and the big turning point came in 1899 with Lorenzo Snow. The church was drowning in debt, and he announced a new revelation that completely redefined tithing. He got rid of that huge upfront property donation, which made the whole thing way more manageable for the average person. Honestly, this one single change was a total game changer. And the effect was instant. I mean, just look at these numbers. In 1898, the year before the change, you had about 18% of members paying at least some tithing. The very next year, right after Snow's announcement, that number skyrockets to almost 26%. That is a huge jump, and it was exactly what the church needed to stabilize its finances and start fresh. Okay, so here's another thing that might surprise you. Today, everyone knows the LDS Church has an unpaid lay ministry, right? Well, that wasn't always true. For a big chunk of the 19th century, if you served in a local position, you actually got paid. And we even have Brigham Young in his own words complaining about it. He was talking about how bishops were using up all the tithing they could for their own families. But here's the thing, this wasn't really corruption. That was just how the system worked. Bishops took their pay directly from the tithing they collected, which, by the way, was mostly stuff like produce and livestock, not cash. And it wasn't just the bishops either. Patriarchs, the men who give special blessings, they used to charge a fee. It started at $1 back in the 1840s and went up to $2 by the end of the century. They didn't stop doing this until 1902. It's just another perfect example of how serving in the church was directly linked to getting paid. So, moving to a volunteer ministry didn't happen overnight. It was a step-by-step process. First, in 1884, they put a limit on how much bishops could take, just 8%. Then, in 1896, the first presidency just came out and said no more salaries for local leaders. By the early 1900s, the change was complete, and we had the volunteer system we see today. All right, let's jump into the 20th century, because this is where things get really intense. The stakes are way higher. You've got a period of surprising transparency, followed by some absolutely massive financial crises, and all of this leads to a new corporate structure that, yeah, it saved the church, but it also completely changed how it deals with the public. For a little while there, the church was actually incredibly open about its money. Starting in 1915, they would release these super detailed financial reports every year. You could see exactly where the tithing money was going. But then, as you can see, it just stopped abruptly in 1959. So the big question is, why? What happened? Well, the answer really starts with a string of crises that just kept getting worse. First, you have the Great Depression. Under President Heber J. Grant, the church's finances were stretched to the absolute limit, and they started spending more money than they were bringing in. And that pattern, well, it was about to come back in a big way. Then, after World War II, things really took off. President David O. McKay kicked off this massive global building boom. I mean, they were putting up chapels and temples everywhere, all over the world, at a crazy pace. It was a time of incredible growth, for sure, but the spending was just out of control. And that set the stage for a new and honestly a much more dangerous financial crisis. And the scale of this problem was just huge. By the end of 1962, the church was running a $32 million deficit. Now, to put that in perspective, their total tithing income that year was only around $100 million. This wasn't just a small problem, it was a catastrophic deficit. The church was on the verge of going broke. And we're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet here. The church was literally running out of cash. Their savings were gone, wiped out. Financial records from the time show that leaders were seriously worried they couldn't even make payroll for church employees. This was it, the brink of total financial collapse. And that crisis is why they stopped publishing those financial reports. So who do you call to fix a mess like this? Well, the man who stepped up was N. Eldon Tanner. He was a former Canadian politician who joined the first presidency in 1963. The guy had a serious background in business and government, and he came in and immediately started to overhaul the church's entire financial system. And his plan was fast and decisive. Step 1, he slammed the brakes on that out-of-control building program to stop the financial bleeding. Step 2, he focused everything on building up a cash reserve. And step 3, this was the big one, he brought in modern corporate financing methods, which completely changed how the church handled its money. And that brings us to our final piece of the puzzle, Tanner's rescue plan. It was a massive success. It really laid the groundwork for the church's incredible wealth today, but it also kicked off this new era of financial secrecy, an era that we're still in. So think about it. The annual financial reports were stopped back in '59 because they were hiding these huge deficits. But once N. Eldon Tanner came in and fixed everything, once the church was financially stable again, the transparency never came back. The crisis gave them a reason to close the books, and, well, they just never opened them again. So, let's just quickly recap this wild ride. We saw tithing go from a crushing burden to a simple, sustainable rule. We saw a paid ministry transform into the volunteer leadership we see today. And we saw a devastating financial crisis that not only shut the door on public financial reports, but also sparked the corporate-style changes that created the wealthy institution the church is now. And that all leaves us with one big question to think about. This whole history shows a very clear move from transparency to secrecy, a move that started because of a crisis and continued because of success. So in our world today, where people are demanding more and more openness, what does this story really tell us about that tricky intersection of faith, money, and what the public feels it has a right to know?